All right, thank you, Jeremy. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Gluck of Queens Public Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth session of Combating Racism, presented by ESRT, PLS, and NYLA. This fourth session of Combating Racism in Libraries is titled I Write About Race. In our daily lives, we're often confronted with matters concerning race, but we're not always given the language to articulate these concepts. Presenters of this panel discussion will be discussing the need to write, publish, and supply books that honestly discuss race and racism. How can books and writing be used to facilitate difficult dialogue? As Jeremy said, today's session is supported by Public Library Section and Ethnic Services Roundtable of the New York Library Association. PLS, the Public Library Section of NYLA, is dedicated to supporting public libraries and public library staff of New York State. PLS's goal is to help sustain and improve libraries and library services by providing continuing education opportunities, conference programming, awards, scholarship, advocacy, and by supporting key NYLA initiatives. ESRT, who Casper and I are members of, the Ethnic Services Roundtable of NYLA, is focused on ethnic services, specifically on sharing information through a cooperative network, developing, promoting related collections, designing services, and providing up-to-date funding information. We encourage you all to check out both of these roundtables and consider joining them. We need your support for sure. So I'm going to turn it over to Casper, who will be introducing our panelists and our moderator.
Okay, thanks Sarah for that introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm so excited to join you today. So we would like to welcome our four esteemed panelists who are writers and publishers who dedicate their work to racial awareness. So Jennifer Brown is an award-winning entrepreneur, dynamic speaker, and diversity and inclusion expert. Her book, Inclusion, Diversity, the New Workplace, and the Will to Change will inspire leadership to embrace the opportunity that diversity represents and empower advocates to drive change that resonates in today's world. Richard Bell is a professor of history at the University of Maryland and author of the recent book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, which is shortlisted for the George Washington Prize and Harriet Tubman Prize. Dr. Ron Daniels is a veteran social and political activist. He is a prolific essayist and commentator, and his column Vantage Point appears in numerous newspapers nationwide. Additionally, Dr. Daniels is a founder and president of the Institute of Black World 21st Century, a progressive African-centered, action-oriented resource center dedicated to empowering people of African descent and marginalized communities. And we also have Shabnam Banerjee-McFarland. She's a digital content manager at Barrett Color Publishers. In her role, she oversees all content strategy and production and manages digital marketing assets. She is currently editing 2 books, Dear Black Girl by Tamara Woodfrey Harris and The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. And we are so pleased to welcome our moderator of today's event, Toni Coleman Brown. Toni is an author, coach, market expert, and motivational speaker. Toni lives in Queens, New York with her husband and 2 daughters. Thanks so much for joining us, Toni. Take it away.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys for being here today. And I'm so excited about our esteemed panelists that we have. I mean, we only have an hour and we have a lot to cover. So I am going to jump right in. I want to start with you, Mr. Rick Bell. And we're actually going to cover a bunch of different areas. We're going to talk about the Black experience. We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion. And we're also going to talk about the path forward. So I may jump around a little bit, but I want to start with Rick because I know that he has a hard stop. And I want to talk to you about your book, Stolen. I find the topic, first of all, fascinating, but I'm curious for you to tell the audience, what made you decide to write this particular book and why is it important now?
Well, thanks, Toni, for the question, and to everyone for the invitation. So just so folks know, I'm an historian. I teach at the University of Maryland here in College Park. Try and ignore my British accent. I teach American history here in America. And my new book, Stolen, which is not so subtly placed over one of my shoulders right here, is the true story of 5 free boys, African-American boys aged between 8 and 15, who were kidnapped from the streets of Philadelphia in 1825 by a gang of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free Black kids and adults into Southern slaves, to smuggle them into the Southern slave market. And it turns out, Toni, as you know, that this happened not just to 5 boys, but to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of free African American people between the Revolution and the Civil War. And I wrote this book because I didn't know that before I started out. I knew about Solomon Northup's famous story in 12 Years a Slave, and I'd assumed that what happened to him was a one-off, bad luck. But as I dug into the archives, Toni, I discovered that what happened to him happened so many other times, particularly to children, actually, being snatched away from parents and families and never heard from again. So I wrote this book, Stolen, to educate myself about the phenomenon of kidnapping free African Americans from free cities and free soil into Southern slavery, and then to share my findings with as many people as possible. I think it changes our understanding of what American slavery was, how it grew, and all the many different people who were responsible for that growth, and also the opposition to it. Because some of my historical actors will liberate themselves, an astonishing series of outcomes that bookend the second half of this book.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. Now, Dr. Ron Daniels, you write about the Black experience in a myriad of different ways. What I want to ask you is, why was the George Floyd event, such a tipping point for America? And I mean, you know, Professor Bell, you can chime in as well, but I really would like you to answer that question. Why do you think, from a historic perspective, that this particular event set off such a range of emotions and protests?
Well, thank you, Toni. And let me just say, by way of introduction, I do have a book too. It is called Still on This Journey, The Vision and Mission of Dr. Ron Daniels. So I just want to get that out there. It is a collection of many of my articles and essays, and many of them deal with the question of race. And I think that the question of race in America, and I think Professor Bell hit on it, there has been for years and years and years a perennial credibility gap, so to speak, unwarranted credibility gap in terms of the Black experience. That is to say, things happen in the Black experience and white America does not experience it. So therefore they do not believe us. Oh, this could not possibly happen. The stories that of the capture of free, quasi-free, because even though they were free, they still had certain limits, is something that Professor Bell found enlightening. There was a conversation I had the other day about lynching, and someone said, did that really happen? I mean, they're Black, they're white. I mean, because the fundamental reality is our history has not been an inclusive history. So the George Floyd event, the murder, was a public lynching. So why it became an inflection point, and there have been other events where you saw particularly whites becoming involved in it, increasingly. But here, live on national television, one saw a police officer, I mean, with his knee on the neck for that 11, whatever the minutes were, and 8 minutes, 47 seconds, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And a person like struggling for their life. And it was treated cavalierly. People were pleading. So I think it was the public nature of it. This was a public lynching, if you will. And I think that is the thing that galvanized, you know, so many people. In fact, millions of people were galvanized around this moment of inflection. So I think that was what was particularly unique about George Floyd.
Now, you said something that was interesting because you said that, the Black experience is one where it's our experience, and because white people don't experience it, they don't believe that it exists. Now, I want to flip this over to Jennifer Brown, because when it comes down to diversity and inclusion, especially in the workplace, oftentimes when African Americans will present their issues and they will present, the racism and the unconscious bias that happens in the workplace, oftentimes they feel gaslighted, so to speak, because they get like, that's not happening, or that's not real, or that can't be possible. What has been your experience in introducing diversity and inclusion programs to people when these types of things are brought up?
Yeah, we always say, believe people the first time, right? But unfortunately, like you say, sometimes we need to prove and overprove the business case, as we say, right? The need for this, unfortunately. So what we do is we literally collect data, both qualitative and quantitative, from the workforce itself in their voice. And if we're lucky enough, and you are lucky enough to work for an organization where there is a critical mass of people that look like you, which is a big if, by the way, we would come in and gather that information in focus groups and surveys where there's very trusted space holding and containers built for that feedback, right? Here, this is what happened to me. Here's the microaggressions I always hear. Here's what happened in the promotion and advancement conversation and process. And we feed that back to decision makers, and the decision makers are largely white and male usually. And it's it's a moment of reckoning. Particularly now, it lands differently than it has for years in this space. It is denial. It is, oh, not me, I'm a good person. What do you mean people feel like that in my organization? We work really hard to have this kind of XYZ environment, or I feel comfortable here, so therefore I don't believe other people don't feel comfortable. I mean, the list is long of the things that I think we've got to get through as consultants to say, no, this is real and it's more than one person, so you cannot dismiss. And this is what your people are telling you, and you are missing out on all the richness of the talent that you say you work really hard to attract. How are we retaining all of those brilliant individuals before they leave because they're so uncomfortable in this culture that the very act of belonging is difficult every day? And so I sort of play on both empathy, facts, data, personal stories, the impact on the business. I do whatever I can, but it's frustrating to have to work so hard, to your point, when I feel like this should be self-evident. So we just need, I hope this summer has provided a now you've been told, in a much bigger way than you've ever been told before what's really going on. And now it is about action. It's not about questioning whether it's true. It is leadership accountability. What are we going to do about this?
Jennifer, that's great. But there's some people who believe that diversity and inclusion initiatives are divisive.
Oh.
And why do you say that that's not true?
No way. That's true. You are excluding to include, right? And
Right.
Why is that? Two wrongs don't make a right kind of thing. I believe we do a lot of work with affinity groups in the workplace, which means like the Black network, the LGBTQ plus network, the women's network. There are populations of identity in our workplaces who don't feel safe on a day-to-day basis. And I know that's a hard concept to explain to people where the workplace was built by and for people that looked like them. And so that is a foreign concept but literally I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and half of us are still closeted in the workplace. We're lying about who we are. We're changing, who's in our families. I mean, we're sort of twisting ourselves up into knots to get through every day. So the safety piece is really critical. And I think, yes, we do need to have a place where we can come and close the door and say, here's what's happening for me, here's what it feels like. And the psychological safety we can experience with each other is, I think, the first step of change. You know, we need to find our voice collectively and say, wait, I'm being gaslit, like you said. Is this real? Am I really hearing this? Right? And I think we need to gather and say, yes, we are hearing that. What do we want to do about that? How do we want to bring our story to bear and influence the institution for the better? So I do think it's easy for people who feel safe to say that safe spaces aren't needed.
That's funny. I mean, I know that in the world right now, everybody seem to be put in these different ecosystems because of social media and internet algorithms. So, you know, it's hard to sometimes get people to come to meet in the middle, you know, and not look at everything from their perspective. But now, how do companies implement diversity and inclusion initiatives without coming across as being disingenuous?
Yes. So you saw this summer organizations be very performative about their allyship, right? Versus the deeper work on equity that we need.
Right.
And there was a lot of pressure to respond, to say something, to not know what you needed to say even, right? And when you do so, does it feel authentic? Usually not, particularly if there hasn't been work that's been sustained over time, not just in 2020, but so it really caught a lot of organizations, I think, unaware and realizing they needed to do a lot more. So avoiding the claiming something without having done the work, it means that I would like more leaders and organizations to say, we haven't done this well. And we're not going to try to jump on this bandwagon. Instead, we're going to talk about, like, share our numbers, work on our pay equity, think about, you know, what we're listening to and hearing and soliciting from our workplace so that we can be better, and sharing that publicly. You know, it's difficult for organizations to say, we don't do this well. We want to be better. We're in learning mode. And, you know, we are on a journey. And I think that acknowledging that and then laying out the steps of the journey is really what people are going to be watching for. I want to know that my organization is more than just performatively doing this, but that we're going to, like, dig into each policy and practice and procedure and root out inequities that are keeping some of our population, keeping us from thriving. And that's really the tough work ahead. I actually think the toughest work is ahead, because this is the more complicated, less glamorous work. It's not the public statement anymore. It is literally like digging in and challenging our norms, the way we've always done things. And honestly, coming up against that sort of white normative culture, which has shaped the workplace. And there's a lot of feelings around that. There's probably going to be a lot of smoke screens and gaslighting and techniques to try to obfuscate and deny and minimize and say, oh, you know, can't we just go back to feeling comfortable? And none of us want to stay in discomfort, but staying in discomfort means that we're ready for change.
That's interesting. Now, I would like to ask Professor Bell and Dr. Daniels this question, because, you know, I truly believe that some people are unaware, but then I believe that some people are aware, and it's just, and they're comfortable with the way things are. So my question to you guys, because you guys are historians, do you believe that the impact of slavery will ever be healed in this American culture? So either one of you can take that.
I'm happy to kick off. And so, yeah, I would say that we can never really underestimate the deep wounding damage that slavery as a legal economic institution did to everyone in this country, African Americans most especially, of course, and to other places and spaces, not the least of which is Africa itself, of course. And that so many of the, I think, racial flashpoints and crisis and tensions and problems that we are demonstrably living with today have very deep roots in this country, and in my own country as well, to be clear, Britain and various other places around the Western world. And yet, I'm sure all of us have run into people, perhaps on social media, in the comments on various things that we post from time to time, a degree of, I think, willful amnesia or deniability. We saw this burst out into the public when the New York Times published the 1619 Project about a year ago, trying to center American history around the correct notion that slavery is fundamental to America's story, and to see the pushback against the idea that slavery was a central feature of American history, and that slavery's legacies in other manifestations of white supremacy like segregation, Jim Crow, lynching, and on among certain segments of the American public was incredibly dispiriting for me. And I just encourage all of us to realize that we live in history, which means that history informs the way we live now, that we are the product of centuries of, in this case, white supremacy and oppression, but we're also living through history in the sense that we can change things. We do not have to accept this status quo as the way it must always be in time immemorial. Many of us like to think, if we were living in the civil rights era of the 1960s or the anti-slavery era of the 1850s, that we know what side we would be on, right? Because we're good people. Well, if we're good people now, then let's walk that walk, as Jennifer was saying, right? Let's do the difficult work, face the difficult pasts, difficult presents, difficult futures, so that when we are judged by future historians, by our grandchildren, by everyone else, we can say that we didn't just espouse some platitudes about diversity. We did the difficult work of trying to make this country a more perfect union.
Awesome.
Well, I certainly want to comment on that question. It's just interesting because I'm really at the center of the reparations movement in this country in many respects.
Nice.
But I also think it's important to understand that, first of all, the 1619 Project was incredibly important because it shared information. There is a sense that if some people knew better, they would do better, right? But there is privilege. White privilege is a reality. Not only is it a reality within white America, I mean, if you understand and look at the slave codes, and if you looked at places like New Orleans, it was also internal to Black America. If you're light, you're all right, yellow, mellow, brown, stick around, Black, get back. And because that is the continuum that we have. And so if you were in New Orleans and various other places, the closer you got to whiteness, the more privileges you were given. And so that, because whiteness, is the fundamental foundation. When I have occasion to have to teach my racial and ethnic politics classes, we go back and we have to make the provocative statement that America was created as a white man's, and I emphasize man's because it was not created to be for women, land. And you can document it. The Naturalization Act of 1797 or whatever. I mean, and I give them point after point after point where it is actually written in that way. It is deeply embedded, therefore, in the fabric of American culture and society. So I'm a proponent of, the intellectual, the action-oriented theorist. So we don't just sort of study about this, the question of what we do about it. And so social movements become the fundamental prescription for how things change. So Jennifer is able to, in fact, even have a conversation in corporate America with caucuses and affinity groups, which never would have been there except for people who push through social movements to, in fact, either sully the brand and or withhold resources or whatever in order to bring these corporations to the table. Now, there are always some people who will, be persuaded and who out of conscience and whatever. But at the end of the day, power is that's why people had said in the 60s, Black Power, because at the end of the day, they got tired of trying to persuade people. Power is the ultimate answer. And so, yes, I do believe that this nation will reckon with slavery. And it is progressing now in a way that I frankly would never have believed in my own lifetime. And it is progressing through the struggle for reparations in its many forms. There's a bill before the Congress of the United States called H.R. 40, first introduced by Congressman John Conyers in 1989 and year and after that. But it was really a study bill. But the studies are piling up in academia showing a direct correlation between the wealth and growth and explosive development of American capitalism and the enslavement of people. And so it's not just the physical stuff, but it is the damage that in terms of cultural identity. And certainly when it comes down to the Brits and so forth and so on, Walter Rodney's classic book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, talks about how Barclays Bank and Lloyd's of London, all of these institutions were built off of the capital and wealth of the slave trade. So we are pushing with HR 40 in a way that, and right now, I mean, this bill never had more than 40 sponsors before. And by the way, it's been changed from a study bill to a remedy bill. We now have 157 sponsors for this bill. It is now supported by Nancy Pelosi. It's supported by Steny Hoyer. There's a companion bill in the Senate of the United States. There is now, because of this long-standing movement, including the most recent uprisings, that is pushing towards a reckoning on all of these different issues. Race, class, sexual orientation, gender, all these issues are coming to a point. And so, yes, I do believe that reparations is possible. I do believe this nation can deal with enslavement. But at the end of the day, this reparations cuts to the heart of structural institutional racism and white supremacy. And only by dealing with reparations will there be the possibility of healing and a more perfect union.
So, Dr. Ron Brown, how do you get there when, you know, African American history is almost being erased out of books? You know, I mean, so how do you get there from a historic perspective when the history is being removed? So did we lose him? Dr. Brown? I mean, I'm sorry, Dr. Ron Daniels?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you mentioned someone else. Well, I think that certainly today, fortunately, we've been liberated. I mean, social media is both, and these platforms are both a blessing and a curse, because we also have very negative stuff that goes out as well. But projects like the 1619 Project, I mean, this was an audacious step, but it also was a reflection of where this country is moving. I think what we're experiencing in terms of the pushback and the danger of what we see in this country is because there are people who really want to cling to what America was. This notion of a white man's land with women and others as an appendage, as appendages to the process. So I think there are, you know, articles are being written every day on the internet, all kinds of articles and information. And so I think that's one way to do it. The other is people form study groups. You know, forming study groups. We don't have to be passive. We can form our own study groups, and we can learn from each other, and we can share what we know. So, and I think we have to continue to push for the inclusion of studies, not just, I mean, African American studies to be sure, but this multicultural fabric of American society, you know, has to be included. And so therefore, I think multicultural studies is an integral part of it. And I think what the understanding is that, you know, it talks about what really happened in history, because we have a lot of people who don't know what really happened in history. It's a sanitized, you know, chopping down the cherry tree and Honest Abe. And, you know, I mean, it's not that these things are totally mythical, but they miss the point of what happened in history. And if people, I think some people, if they knew better, knew more, they would do better. So I think there are many, many ways in which this can be done. It can be shared. And I think these kinds of conversations, which are being conducted by the Library Association, certainly are a valuable contribution to the process.
I agree. And I definitely believe that, you know, the books that you guys have written definitely help with that. Now, Shabnam, I have not forgotten about you. And you are currently editing a book that I'm really excited about. It's coming out in March of 2021, and it's called Dear Black Girls. And it's a collection of letters by Black women to Black girls. So I would like to know how did editing that book impact you?
Oh, it was, hi everyone. It was deeply moving, and especially as, you know, a non-Black woman, but a woman of color, figuring out how to be delicate and thoughtful with my edits, such that we're not losing or erasing anything unintentionally, or at least for me, unintentionally. And, you know, I think we'll get to we might get to the conversation around diversity in publishing and the importance of having representation behind the veil of publishing in order to more accurately, thoughtfully, sensitively capture the stories of the diversity of America. But this book in particular was just such a wonderful, I mean, Tamara wrote The Sisters Are All Right back in 2015, which is basically a look at all of the different stereotypes that limit the perceptions of Black women in America. And she's such a talented writer. And I think Barrett Kohler is in a unique position in that we work with authors who are activists, frontline change agents, consultants, who are in communities, in organizations, writing about their experiences and the conversations that they're having, not from this grand art perspective, but in terms of the intimate conversations that they're having with folks and with communities. So Dear Black Girl was one of those moments where you get chills reading each and every letter. And the way that she has structured the manuscript and structured the book is through all of the different growth stages and moments of reflection that really shape who we are as people. So she talks about family and chosen family. She talks about sex and sexuality. She talks about violence. She talks about mental health. And the most important thing was keeping the integrity of the letter writers front and center. So not speaking on behalf of people and not assuming that she had a narrative or a story that superseded the letter writers, but really letting the chorus of voices shine through. Saidiya Hartman writes a lot about the chorus and the importance of chorus in Black women and the relationships that Black women have. So the way that the manuscript is structured is that Tammy will come in at the beginning of every chapter and say, this is why I chose to highlight this particular topic, whether it be about emergence into sexual relationships and the things that you need to consider. It's also highly practical too. So it was cathartic for the letter writers themselves to be able to speak on their own behalf, but it also offers advice, right? Like, here are the things you need to know before getting into something like this, or it's okay for you to be in a chosen family if your family doesn't accept your gender identity. And so it runs this incredibly diverse spectrum of Black womanhood and Black girlhood in a way that my role was to help Tammy and these letter writers shine and be a steward of, like, let's just get this book through the production process, but not damage or harm or take out or speak on behalf of any experience that I don't have. And so I think epistolaries are really useful in that way, in that you get a collection of letters and you get people to speak on their own behalf. And they're not super common anymore. They were definitely more common during the Harlem Renaissance, but they're not as common anymore. So to be able to be part of that literary tradition was just, I mean, I come from a cultural studies, American studies, critical race theory background academically. And so that was important to me, that, like, not to step on any toes, but just to be the steward of, let's get this through the production process, which is not common in publishing, unfortunately. The relationship that editors have with authors is much more like /red X's, you can't do this, take this out, like, I want you to say this. Whereas my approach to editorial work is from a place of deep partnership of, like, what do you feel is most important to say right now, and not to impose my own projection of what I think this should be, but to elevate and magnify that which you're already trying to do.
That's awesome. And, actually, that's one of the things that I do. We also collect stories and anthologies. We have, like, a Delayed But Not Denied, book 1 through 3. And we also did Our Stories, Our Voices, Black Men Speak Their Truth. So I know how it is to collect those stories. Now, you talk about the, this particular book and the author's story. Why stories and letters? Why is this particular book important to the Black experience and to help us move forward in terms of diversity and inclusion?
It's a great question. It's interesting. So I've been working in publishing for about 5 years. And when I first started in publishing, maybe about a year back in 2016 was the first time publishing had ever done a diversity survey. It was the first anytime that they had ever released any kind of numbers on the number of people of color, LGBTQ, disabled people that work in publishing, and the numbers were abysmal. Like it was 91% white and 89% women, and it was 98% able-bodied. The numbers were abysmal. And so you'll get a lot of processes, kind of what Jennifer was talking about. You'll get a lot of processes and workplace systems that are built around a very specific identity. And so coming into it, when you don't fit within that identity and you're the only person on staff that questions, what did I hear? What I just hear? Some of the things that would come up early on in the grand scheme of publishing is that a book about Black women for Black women there's no audience for it. It's too small. We won't make any money on a book like this because the audience is too small, and we can't publish something like this because it's too risky for us. And that is, one, insane to me, but two, it cuts ourselves off at the knees in terms of like how we relate to, connect with, empathize, be compassionate towards experiences that are different from our own. Just because this book isn't about you or for you doesn't mean you can't read it and learn something from it. And that the different kinds of ways that we relate to audiences and communities has to be rooted in this compassion and empathy and trust for each other, and not making these assumptions that this is too narrow a market. We can't sell enough books if this is just about written by Black women for Black women. And so making these decisions, I hate the term gatekeeping, but it is what there's a very strong sense of gatekeeping within publishing, making these decisions to say that the market and the audience is bigger than what we imagine it to be, and that it is our responsibility to seek out and make those connections as publishers to connect people with each other with stories that are different from their own, and say that this is valuable for you. Those are the decisions that we make as editors, as publishers, as marketers. That's why this is so important, is that there needs to be an institutional shift. And like Jennifer said, going back to the deep work of challenging our norms and our assumptions such that we are valuing and lending support and partnership to these stories, and being delicate with them and because they are precious stories. So that I think is why we choose to work with the authors and the people that we work with from this place of deep partnership and saying, I see value in the work that you do and who you are.
I love that you said that. And I used to work for Doubleday Direct back in the day when it was the Doubleday Book Club. And, we took, the publishers' books and turned them into book club editions. And I actually, back in 1999, created Black Expressions Book Club with Doubleday Direct. And, the riches are in the niches. I have to tell you that when we launched that book club, it was the best and most profitable book club launch in the history of that company. We made millions and millions of dollars. And I think that, in listening to this conversation, and Professor Bell, you said something about economics, right? And racism being related to economics. And I think that if people understood the financial impact of diversity and how in these corporate environments, if there was more diversity, they would probably make more money, that a lot of people probably wouldn't have such barriers to entry as it relates to diversity and inclusion. I mean, I think that, wow. I'm so excited though that book is coming into play. And I know that you're in a space that's a unique one. You're also into digital content management. And I'm sure that when you walk in a room of, digital content creators, there are not a lot of people that look like you. So how do you deal with that? How do you handle that on a regular basis?
Good question. Thank you for asking it. No, there's not. Thankfully, I think the independent publishing world is far more diverse than the big five publishing world. So I do work for a publisher that is about a third people of color. I will be honest, it didn't start that way when I first started there, but, you know, Barrett-Kohler has made significant effort to walk their talk. And I think, you know, as a publisher who works with a significant number of diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, we're editing these books and then we're like, oh, I guess that's a really good idea. We should implement that. So I think, you know, we're in a unique position in that, like, in order for us to be more effective in the partnerships that we have with authors, we need to adopt it. And so, you know, I found that being a boisterous woman of color, specifically in both kind of straddling the tech world and the publishing world, to go back to your point about the riches are in the niches, like, you can't deny that. And so yeah. the more I'm saying, hey, there's something over here, and the more leadership listens to me, and the more I, you know, I'm able to partner with authors that it might seem their content might seem niche, the more we can see how that blossoms and blooms, and that, like, we're stronger together. So my perspective is that I read this, like, organizational development, like, academic article, in that when you have a structure, if everybody's in the center of the structure, they're all seeing the same thing. Whereas if you have someone on the periphery, they're able to see outside of the structure and in the structure at the same time from a very specific vantage. So it behooves us to have people at different vantages and different perspectives to come with different experiences, because they can acknowledge blind spots or things that we're not seeing. They see a perspective of a structure differently. So it's with a lot of self-care and a lot of, you know, connecting with friends and family, and being assured that I'm not crazy, I'm not seeing things, that I'm able to say what I see is actually beneficial, because I'm not seeing the same thing as you. And that has been an opportunity for us, you know, to go back to the riches and the niches with The Body Is Not an Apology. That book, she was recently on, Sonia Renee Taylor was recently on Brene Brown's podcast. We had, you know, pretty conservative projections in terms of how that book was going to do, but the way we led that marketing campaign was around coalition building. So it wasn't an assumption that this is for the general reader. We went in and said, how would this impact someone who might be Black? How would this impact someone who might be disabled? How would this impact, like, and being very specific in terms of how we're reaching out to people and building a coalition around this book, which has since sold 70,000 copies. And that shift in that what I see is different, and that's actually a good thing, has been, again, a journey in self-care and self-love, but a very empowering one. Especially because I see it as an asset that I don't look like everybody else, and that I don't come from the same experience as everyone else that I'm in rooms with. So. Wow,
that's awesome. That's awesome. Go ahead, Professor Bell. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on some of the comments on niches there, and also come back to something Dr. Daniels said earlier on about what's now shining a spotlight on these issues. And I just, you know, my sense is that for all the atrocities that come across our screens, part of the reason so many of us are engaged with this work is because of the careful work already being done by teachers in our schools, by educators, by librarians, of course, as well, right? If my library in my local community is anything like the other libraries around this country, then librarians are already deeply engaged in this work, and recognizing that we have a great opportunity as different types of educators here to make sure that people who are momentarily engaged with the work of social justice, as they respond to Breonna Taylor, to George Floyd, to whoever is next in this endless catalog of atrocity and misery, that people who want to engage and read something don't just stop after reading one thing, right? Librarians in particular have played such an important role in cultivating a larger, deeper, broader conversation. When I go into my libraries and I see displays of relevant books, and when there are book clubs and speaker series, and we start with something that everyone wants to learn about, like Ibram Kendi's great book, Stamped from the Beginning, or How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then we don't stop there. We use that as a springboard, a launching off point for our own reflection and examination, but also broader reading and education and all the wonderful work coming out from so many different directions. Librarians are at the forefront of this work, and it's amazing to see how much these folks are already doing and have been doing, honestly, for years now.
Yes, yes, you're so right, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because this platform is an excellent one, and this is how we move the conversation forward. I mean, I am a member of probably one of the oldest African American book clubs in Brooklyn called United Sisters Book Club, and it's funny because every time we get together and we're reading a book, they always say, "Well, I got my book from the library. I got my book from the library." So and I'm like, well, I bought my book from Amazon, and I always feel so bad. But the library plays such an important role in all of this, and I think that what we have to do is keep moving forward. Now, I really would like to shift a little bit because we have some questions from our audience here, and I think Shabnam, they wanted to know what was the title of the book. I know we talked about Dear Black Girl, but what was the title of the other book about the bodies?
Oh, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. It's a wonderful book. The second edition will be coming out early next year in February. It'll have a foreword by Ijeoma Oluo, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race. It's been endorsed by Kimberly Crenshaw and Alicia Garza. So it's a really powerful book that basically the premise of the book is that the work that we want to see in the world and any kind of change effort and in inclusion and kind of redistributing power has to happen internally first. And we need to stop apologizing for our bodies. And that's not to say that self-care and self-acceptance, the buck stops there. It's that the work that we want to see in the world has to happen internally as well. And that radical acceptance and that radical love has to exist within us in order for us to share it with others.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Now, there was a question, and this one is, what does a non-white heteronormative workplace look like? And what does the LGBTQ normative workplace look like? I think that question is for you, Jennifer Brown. So, yeah, so what does that look like in your opinion?
Is the question what would an inclusive workplace of more identities
Yes.
look like and feel like, right?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Wow, we have so much work to do to audit our language so that what's in the written communications and also what is spoken and how we speak about things, we need to use inclusive language. So an LGBTQ plus friendly workplace and welcoming workplace would be one, for example, where we don't assume heterosexuality and we don't assume cisgender identity. So cisgender identity, I identify as a cisgender woman. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am technically the dominant gender identity. But that doesn't mean that I know who's on my team and my colleagues and how others identify. So it really means that all of us have to take our lens kind of off for a moment and maybe permanently and begin to see things through the lenses of all the diverse experiences of others in our workplaces, and then actually learn enough so that we can welcome that and seek it, and then have all of our processes, policies, language, communications, products reflect the input and the language used by different communities. We want to see ourselves in our companies. We want to see ourselves in the products that we work on. We want to hear if we have leadership, quote unquote, we want to hear that leadership speak to us as if they know who we are and they see us. And I think that that's the big tragedy and missed opportunity with a largely white and male and heterosexual and cisgender identified leadership, is that group has to work a lot harder to be competent at this. And that's where I live all the time, to sort of sit in that bridge and say, hey, here's what you don't know so much, and you'll never have that lived experience, but you may be adjacent to it. You may be hiding and covering a lot of diversity dimensions actually yourself as you walk through the world looking the way you do. So I do think we can't just assume that a group of people knows nothing about diversity. Yeah. It's just that it's so tightly normative. It's the expectations, and I always call it the man box is tight. It is a tight, dark place. And we need to liberate all of us actually around, vulnerability and authenticity and bringing our full selves to work. And it hasn't been okay. And some of us have paid a very steep price in trying to do that and in trying to shift our organizations with our truth. And because there's still so much bias, so much stigma, so much penalty. So we've got to sort of, as we bring our full selves to work and try to, shift the organization through our own authenticity, we've got to be met by the appetite and the will to change, and the consistent interest and commitment to seeing and hearing everyone, and then saying, okay, so if I'm going to be vigilant about this, I'm going to challenge who's in the room and at the table. I'm going to challenge how we listen or don't listen or take into account viewpoints and diversity of experience and thought in our creative process. I think the role of potential allies in doing this would mean a lot less heavy lifting on the part of those of us who are not seen and heard. And right now, those of us who are not really seen and heard and reflected are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and we're not being met with an equivalent. So that was why I wrote my book, to say, hey, step forward. And, by the way, we're doing shameless plugs.
Yes.
Just got to show it. But it was my attempt to say, look, it's not enough what we're doing. It has never been enough.
Right.
And we cannot outsource this work. It has to be taken into each of us. And we've got to figure out a way forward. And it's going to be uncomfortable, awkward. We're not going to have the answers. We're going to mess up. I think, speaking of libraries, I think there's a lot of white people in particular right now who are very lost, very overwhelmed, very confused, learning a lot, but not understanding how to apply it. It's new information. It's not new information in the world, but it's new to many people. And so, that's what I kind of wake up thinking about every day, to say, how can we go forward together through this?
Yeah, companies have a lot to deal with. I mean, it's diversity, and diversity is so many different things. And I mean, and let's not speak about the generational differences, because right now in the workforce, there's about 4 or 5 different generations that are still in the workplace working together. And that, I mean, I have a multi-generational household, and I have to tell you, I have a Gen Z, a millennial, a baby boomer, a Gen X, and we go crazy around here. We don't know how to speak to each other. So, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot. And I mean, we have a lot of work to do in that area on a lot of different fronts. But I think that having employee resource groups are great. You spoke about having an ally. Now, people talk about having an ally, and they also talk about having a sponsor, and they're different, but you need both. So, explain that a little bit.
It's words they have so many different connotations. I guess, like, I might actually argue sometimes a true ally can also be a sponsor, because some of what I would like allyship to be is sharing of capital. So we talk about power needing to be shared, and there's enough to go around. I'm an abundance mentality person, not necessarily if I give you something, then I have less, which is actually a predominant belief that we have to kind of wrestle with. But so an ally, a true ally, and a sponsor, technically defined, is somebody who shares their capital, who literally puts their power in play alongside someone, and literally shifts the outcomes for and alongside that person. And that, to me, in the organizational context, that means that I'm championing someone, I'm raising their name, I'm raving about their qualifications, I am defending against microaggressions and calling peers accountable. I'm educating, right? I'm activated, and so I do think ally. I might say sponsor is somebody with power to shift things, and maybe an allyship can exist. It's a sponsor in a way, but it can exist at all levels, because some of us we always have something we can be sharing, I believe. We all have an access to privilege, access, power, safety, permission. There's I like to we need to really like broaden how we talk about privilege too. That I'm LGBTQ+, and I have tons of privilege that I need to marshal alongside, in solidarity with others. And I know, Shabnam, you'd say the same exact thing. Like, it's really 360-degree allyship that I would like to see, where, we all have some kind of access to something that is not shared by someone else, and that is causing that disparate impact. So that's something I think about a lot. Sponsors in the corporate context An executive sponsor is somebody that can pull you up that pipeline, can say,
Right.
you know, I'm going to pay attention to this person, and literally they're not going to have to do all the pushing because I'm going to pull. I'm going to use what I have. And if we have that single thing happening more, we would see more diversity in the C-suite. We would see more women and people of color and others that are making it through the gauntlet of the organizational hierarchy, because we need us to make it. We must make it. We can't spill out of organizations, because then we never ever see change, and change is important to see at the top. So critical.
Very, very true. So we're winding down, and you know, I want to say thank you to the panelists. I want you to say, I have one final question for each of you, and we're going to use this almost like a speed round. But you know, thank you, Dr. Ron Daniels, for speaking about people who grew up in New Orleans. I happen to be one of those people. Thank you very much for that, and thank you, you know, all of you. But I want to ask you, Professor Bell, I know you have to go, but the title of this panel discussion was, I Write About Race. Why do you write about race?
I write about race because the struggle for racial justice, the freedom struggle, is the central story of American history. If you're doing American history and are not deeply engaged with the freedom struggle, I'm not sure you're doing American history.
Awesome. Dr. Ron Daniels, the topic of the panel discussion, take yourself off of mute. The topic of the panel discussion is, I write about race. Why do you write about race?
Well, I write about race because, taking off a point that Professor Bell talked about earlier, we have a responsibility to educate some. And so, you know, we have that obligation. So when Shabnam, I'm sorry, spoke about critical race theory, I said, gee, you know, it's good to have had the opportunity, the privilege to teach Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in my earlier incarnation. And I also think it's important to write because I think we have to also talk about what is the mission and vision for corporations and inclusion and diversity. So that's why I write about it, because at the end of the day, one of the most important things that happened when we talked about the inflection point is it was so gratifying to see employees of these corporations take this moment and go outside and demand that they deal with social justice, demand that they invest in communities. Because absent that, it's just diversity and inclusion, which is a good thing, but it does not reach out in terms of advancing the mission of social justice in our communities.
Awesome. Shabnam, you are a content manager, so you write, you edit books about race. So I'm going to ask you the same question. Why do you, but it's a little bit, with a little bit of spin, why do you advocate for race?
Yeah, I kind of come at it from two different perspectives. I think one, to echo Professor Bell, that when I don't understand something, I want to read about it, and I want to work with people who are thinking and writing about it for my own selfish pursuit of trying to understand why things are the way that they are. And I'm also mixed race, and I think, you know, census data show that more and more people like me are entering positions of leadership, by Professor Bell, and the job market, and have a voice. And so if we can't understand this tangle of our history and how race is made and can be unmade, then we have no hope of moving forward. And so I think, you know, one, because I'm trying to understand myself and I want to work with people who are writing about people like me and are people like me. And then two, we have no hope for a vision of the future unless we excavate our history to do so.
That part, that's awesome. Jennifer Brown, why do you write about race?
Oh, thank you for asking. It's an honor to be on my learning journey. I learn by writing as well and teaching. And I think the messenger matters with this conversation as much as the message. And I think it's critical that people that look like me write about our learning process about race and be comfortable being uncomfortable and role model that and walk that path and talk about what it's like to walk that path so that others may follow. And so it's my total privilege of this lifetime to do this work. And be on my own learning journey and share what that's like, and make it somehow more psychologically safe for others to undertake the journey, because we all need to go together, and it's going to take all of us to remediate everything that's happened in this country. So I'm super energized about that, and you know, I will keep working on it with my last breath.
Awesome. That is awesome. So I want to thank you guys for being on this panel. I want to thank the New York Public Library Association. It's nyla.org. You guys can find out more information about our panelists on the website. I know there were some questions about the publishing companies, not a lot of questions though, but this has truly been a very interesting and moving conversation. I'm truly looking forward to seeing more books from you, reading more commentary from each and every one of you. This has been an amazing, amazing discussion. So right now I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremy, and he can close us out, or Casper, you can close us out.